The morning of February 23rd, 1943, in a converted schoolhouse outside Munich, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sits alone at a wooden desk, pen in hand, composing his daily letter to his wife Lucy. The routine has become sacred to him during the war. Nearly every dawn he writes to her, revealing thoughts he would never share with subordinates or superiors. Today's letter is different. His handwriting, usually precise, despite his battlefield habits, trembles slightly as he describes what he witnessed just days earlier at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. He pauses, choosing his words carefully, knowing censorship might intercept anything too frank. Yet he cannot suppress what he has seen. American supplies captured during the offensive, warehouses full of equipment, fuel depots larger than anything the Afrika Korps possessed in 2 years of desert warfare, mountains of ammunition, crates of food, spare parts for every conceivable machine. The scale defied German understanding of war. Rommel writes a single line that will go unnoticed by historians for decades. The material abundance is beyond anything we have encountered. He does not elaborate. He cannot. To admit the full scope of what he witnessed would be to acknowledge a truth so devastating it threatens the entire German war strategy. America is not simply another enemy. America is an industrial civilization that fights wars differently than any nation in history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 6 days earlier, Rommel had stood on a ridge above the Kasserine Pass, watching his panzers smash through inexperienced American defenses. The battle was a tactical masterpiece. Green American troops, many seeing combat for the first time, retreated in disorder. German forces captured 183 tanks, more than 200 artillery pieces, 500 trucks. It was a staggering haul by European standards. But it was the quality of what was captured that disturbed Rommel. Every American truck was new, factory fresh. The tanks, though inferior to German panzers in armor and firepower, were mechanically perfect, recently manufactured, shipped across an ocean, and delivered to the front without apparent strain on American industrial capacity. The fuel alone captured 57,000 gallons, properly refined, high-octane gasoline, stored in standardized containers that the Germans immediately recognized as superior to their own jerry cans. Food supplies captured at American depots included fresh meat, canned vegetables, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, medical supplies, all in quantities that German soldiers had not seen since the invasion of France 3 years earlier. One panzer commander reported finding an entire field kitchen abandoned intact, complete with portable refrigeration units. Refrigeration. In the North African desert, the Germans had been eating tinned sardines and stale bread for months. Rommel had fought the British for 2 years in North Africa, always outnumbered, always short of supplies, always dependent on convoys across the Mediterranean that were increasingly intercepted by Allied air and naval forces. He had learned to improvise, to stretch every liter of fuel, to cannibalize damaged tanks for spare parts, to make brilliance compensate for scarcity. That was the German way of war. Superior tactics, superior training, superior leadership, overcoming material disadvantage. The Americans represented something different. They did not fight with brilliance. They fought with abundance. And Rommel, watching American soldiers abandon perfectly functional equipment rather than defend it, began to understand a horrifying truth. America could afford to lose this battle. Germany could not afford to win many more like it. Within hours of the victory at Kasserine, Rommel composed a detailed report for Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. He described American tactical deficiencies, poor coordination between units, inadequate training for desert warfare, weak leadership at the battalion level. All of this was accurate. The Americans had performed poorly, but Rommel also included observations that were more troubling. American equipment, while sometimes technically inferior, was present in staggering quantities. Logistics appeared limitless. Supply columns stretched for miles. The defeated American units were already being resupplied, re-equipped, and prepared for renewed operations, while Rommel's own forces struggled to maintain their advanced positions due to fuel shortages. Most significantly, Rommel noted that captured American soldiers, despite their defeat, displayed no sense of desperation. They expected to be fed well as prisoners. They assumed medical care would be available. They believed their side would ultimately win, not because of superior tactics or bravery, but because of what one captured sergeant called the stuff back home. The factories, the assembly lines, the industrial machine that these soldiers took entirely for granted. Rommel's report reached Berlin on February 25, 1943. It was forwarded through channels to the Führer's headquarters at Rastenburg, where Hitler maintained his command post in East Prussia, surrounded by concrete bunkers and barbed wire, isolated from the realities of the war he was losing. The report arrived on Hitler's desk, accompanied by similar assessments from other commanders who had engaged American forces. The response came swiftly. On February 27th, barely 48 hours after Rommel's report was filed, a directive was issued from Hitler's headquarters to all senior commanders. The language was unambiguous. Reports concerning American industrial capacity were to be treated with extreme skepticism. Intelligence estimates suggesting overwhelming American material superiority were the product of defeatist thinking. Statistics regarding American production of aircraft, tanks, and ships were dismissed as Jewish propaganda, exaggerations designed to undermine German morale. Rommel received a personal telegram from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The message was brief and pointed. The Führer notes your tactical success at Kasserine. However, assessments of enemy industrial capacity are unwelcome and reflect a misunderstanding of the strategic situation. American productive claims are grossly inflated by Jewish-controlled media. Our intelligence services confirm this. Further reports should focus on operational matters, not political speculation. Rommel read the telegram twice, then placed it in his personal files without comment. He understood immediately what had happened. The truth was inconvenient. Therefore, the truth was forbidden. German strategic planning for 1943 depended on the assumption that Allied production, while significant, remained within manageable parameters. To acknowledge that America alone was outproducing the entire Axis would require a fundamental rethinking of Germany's war aims, and Hitler was incapable of such rethinking. The roots of this delusion ran deep, planted years before the war began. Hitler's understanding of America had been shaped by Nazi ideology, which viewed the United States as a mongrel nation, racially impure, culturally inferior, incapable of sustained military effort. German propaganda throughout the 1930s had portrayed America as weak, decadent, dominated by Jewish financial interests that pursued profit rather than national greatness. This view was not entirely cynical. Hitler genuinely believed it. In Mein Kampf, written nearly 2 decades earlier, he had described Americans as a mixed-race people without the cohesion necessary for great power status. The Great Depression had seemed to confirm this judgment. America's vast industrial capacity had collapsed into unemployment and breadlines, proof that democracy and capitalism created weakness rather than strength. When America entered the war in December 1941 after Pearl Harbor, German leadership initially celebrated. Hitler declared war on the United States, believing it would make little difference. America was 3,000 miles away, protected by oceans, but also isolated by them. Its army was tiny, its soldiers untested, its political system, fractured by debate and compromise, seemed ill-suited to total war. Germany, by contrast, had mobilized completely. Unified under a single will, hardened by years of combat. Early German intelligence reports seemed to support this optimism. American military expansion was chaotic, hampered by labor disputes, inefficient production methods, competing bureaucracies. The U.S. Army in early 1942 numbered fewer than 2 million men compared to Germany's 6 million. American tank production, while growing, used designs that German engineers considered obsolete. The M3 Grant tank with its hull-mounted main gun, was described in German technical assessments as evidence of American inexperience in armored warfare. But beneath these tactical observations lay a more fundamental misunderstanding. Germany measured military strength in qualitative terms: better soldiers, better tactics, better technology. America measured strength in quantitative terms: more soldiers, more weapons, more supplies. The two nations were not even fighting the same kind of war. By mid-1942, isolated reports began reaching Berlin that contradicted the official narrative. Luftwaffe pilots returning from raids over England described swarms of American-built aircraft, bombers and fighters in numbers that exceeded German intelligence estimates by factors of 2 or 3. U-boat commanders reported increasing difficulty in the Atlantic as American-built escort carriers and destroyer escorts appeared in growing numbers. German agents in neutral countries forwarded newspaper articles describing Liberty ship launches where multiple cargo vessels were completed simultaneously in American shipyards. These reports were systematically dismissed. German intelligence, under the control of the SS and influenced by Nazi racial ideology, concluded that such claims were exaggerations, propaganda designed to intimidate Germany into surrender. The underlying assumption was simple. Jews controlled American media and finance. Jews wanted Germany destroyed. Therefore, American industrial statistics were Jewish lies. This interpretation was not merely convenient, it was ideologically necessary. National Socialism, as conceived by Hitler, required enemies to be understood in racial and moral terms, not industrial ones. The war was a struggle between Germanic willpower and Jewish manipulation, between Aryan creativity and Slavic brutality, between National Socialist discipline and democratic chaos. To acknowledge that America was winning through superior industrial organization would require admitting that ideology mattered less than factory capacity. And so, the delusion hardened into official policy. By late 1942, even as American forces landed in North Africa during Operation Torch, German propaganda doubled down on the narrative of American weakness. Newsreels showed American prisoners, emphasizing their youth and inexperience. Radio broadcasts mocked American equipment as inferior copies of European designs. Newspapers published articles by carefully selected experts explaining that American industrial statistics were mathematically impossible, fabrications created by Jewish-controlled press agencies. Rommel, sitting in his Munich office on that February morning in 1943, knew better. He had seen the evidence with his own eyes. At Kasserine Pass, he had not merely defeated an American force, he had glimpsed the industrial machine behind them, and it terrified him. The numbers told a story that German leadership refused to read. In January 1943, the same month that Rommel fought at Kasserine Pass, American factories produced 4,800 aircraft. Not for the entire year. For a single month, Germany, fighting on 3 fronts with its industrial base fully mobilized, produced 2,600 aircraft that same month across all types: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers combined. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, had received these figures from intelligence sources in neutral Switzerland. Swiss industrial observers, maintaining relationships with both sides, provided periodic assessments of Allied production capacity. The reports were detailed, cross-referenced, with multiple sources, technically precise. Speer, himself an architect and technocrat rather than an ideologue, found them credible. He presented them to Hitler in early March 1943. The meeting took place at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, where the Führer increasingly spent time away from the realities of the Eastern Front. Speer arrived with prepared charts, production statistics, comparative analyses. He had learned over years of working with Hitler that visual presentations sometimes succeeded where verbal arguments failed. The charts were meticulous, showing American aircraft production climbing from 18,000 units in 1941 to 47,000 in 1942, with projections exceeding 80,000 for 1943. Hitler studied the charts for perhaps 30 seconds before interrupting. These figures come from enemy sources. They come from Swiss technical observers, Speer replied carefully. The Swiss have no incentive to exaggerate. They've verified production through factory counts, shipping manifests, photographic reconnaissance. The Swiss are influenced by Jewish financial networks. Hitler stated flatly, "These numbers are designed to create defeatism. American Jews control their press, their government, their industrial reporting. They want us to believe in unlimited production capacity to break our will. It's psychological warfare, nothing more." Speer tried a different approach. Mein Führer. Our own observers in North Africa have reported similar findings. Field Marshal Rommel has documented. Rommel sees what the enemy wants him to see. Hitler interrupted again. Captured equipment is deliberately left behind to create an impression of abundance. It's a deception. The Americans are clever propagandists. They learned from us. This was the moment, according to Speer's later memoirs, when he understood that rational argument was impossible. Hitler was not evaluating evidence. He was defending a worldview. To accept American industrial superiority would require accepting that National Socialist ideology had fundamental flaws, that racial theories could not overcome material reality, that the war's outcome might be determined not by willpower or tactics, but by assembly lines and shipping capacity. Speer left the meeting shaken. He returned to Berlin and ordered his own independent assessment, bypassing official intelligence channels. His ministry contacted German businessmen with pre-war connections to American industry, engineers who had studied in American universities, technical experts who understood manufacturing processes. Over the next 6 weeks, they compiled a report that confirmed and, in some cases, exceeded the Swiss estimates. American steel production for 1942 exceeded 80 million tons. Germany produced 32 million tons. American aluminum production was 800,000 tons. Germany produced 230,000 tons. The United States had launched 859 naval vessels in 1942. Germany launched 128. Most significantly, America had done this while simultaneously supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease programs, essentially outfitting 3 separate war efforts. The report included a particularly disturbing section on Liberty ships. These were standardized cargo vessels designed for rapid construction using prefabricated sections and welding rather than traditional riveting. American shipyards had produced 82 Liberty ships in 1941 during the program's first year. In 1942, they produced 697. The average construction time had dropped from 240 days to 42 days. Some shipyards were completing vessels in fewer than 2 weeks. German naval intelligence had initially dismissed Liberty ship reports as propaganda. The idea of building an ocean-going cargo vessel in 2 weeks seemed physically impossible. Traditional shipbuilding required months of careful work by skilled craftsmen. But photographic reconnaissance confirmed the reality. American shipyards operated 24 hours a day with multiple slipways, launching vessels simultaneously. On September 27, 1942, 14 Liberty ships had been launched on a single day across different American ports. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, grasped the implications immediately. His entire strategy depended on sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. In 1942, German U-boats had sunk roughly 1,300 Allied merchant vessels, the most successful year of the campaign. But if America alone could build nearly 700 ships annually while Britain produced additional vessels and damaged ships were repaired, the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic shifted from potential German victory to certain German defeat. Dönitz presented this analysis to Hitler in April 1943, arguing for increased U-boat production and technological innovations that might restore German naval effectiveness. Hitler's response focused not on the strategic problem, but on its source. These American production claims come from Churchill's propaganda ministry and Roosevelt's Jewish advisors. He declared, "They want us to abandon the Atlantic campaign. The actual numbers are likely half what they claim, probably less. Continue operations as planned." This pattern repeated across every domain. Luftwaffe commanders reported that American bomber formations over Germany were growing larger, with better fighter escorts, suggesting aircraft production far beyond German capabilities. Hitler attributed this to concentration of existing forces rather than new production. Wehrmacht generals on the Eastern Front noted that Soviet forces were increasingly equipped with American trucks, which improved Red Army mobility dramatically. Hitler dismissed this as theft or captured equipment, refusing to acknowledge organized Lend-Lease shipments. By mid-1943, German field commanders had developed an informal code for communicating realities that official reports could not contain. They described the enemy as well supplied, rather than overwhelmingly supplied. They noted increasing material advantage, rather than industrial superiority. They emphasized German tactical successes while understating the unsustainable nature of those victories. Rommel had become particularly skilled at this coded language. After returning from North Africa in March 1943, he was assigned to inspect coastal defenses along the Atlantic Wall, preparing for the anticipated Allied invasion of France. His reports to Hitler's headquarters carefully balanced optimism about defensive preparations with veiled warnings about Allied capabilities. In one report from November 1943, he wrote, "The enemy possesses substantial material resources which may permit sustained offensive operations once established ashore. Our defensive strategy must account for an adversary capable of replacing losses quickly." This was the strongest language he could use. To say that the Allies could land unlimited supplies was forbidden. To suggest that German defenders might be overwhelmed by sheer quantity of enemy material was defeatist. So Rommel wrote around the truth, hoping someone in command would read between the lines. No one did. Or, more precisely, those who understood chose silence over confrontation. The German military system, despite its reputation for efficiency, had become paralyzed by ideological conformity. Officers who raised concerns about American industrial capacity were labeled defeatists. Intelligence analysts who provided accurate assessments of enemy production were accused of spreading enemy propaganda. Gradually, the German command structure created its own alternate reality, one where the war remained winnable, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This willful blindness had operational consequences. German production planning for 1943 was based on assumptions that Allied industrial capacity would plateau or decline due to raw material shortages, labor unrest, or strategic bombing. When these assumptions proved false, German forces found themselves consistently outnumbered and outgunned. The gap was visible in every metric. In 1943, America produced 86,000 aircraft. Germany produced 25,000. American tank production reached 29,000 units. German tank production was 12,000. American automotive production, even with much of the industry converted to military use, exceeded Germany's pre-war peak. The United States was producing more trucks in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year, and these numbers only measured American output. They did not include British production, which remained substantial, or Soviet production, which, despite catastrophic losses in 1941 and 42, had recovered behind the Ural Mountains, where evacuated factories produced tanks and artillery in growing numbers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of denying this reality became apparent in the summer of 1943. Operation Citadel, Germany's massive offensive at Kursk in the Soviet Union, was predicated on achieving decisive results through superior German tanks and tactics. The newer Panther and Tiger tanks were indeed superior to Soviet designs in armor protection and firepower, but the Soviets fielded 5 tanks for every German one, and when German panzers were destroyed, they could not be quickly replaced. Soviet losses, though much higher, were replaced within weeks as new T-34 tanks rolled off production lines. German generals who survived the war would later describe Kursk as the moment they knew the war was lost, not because of tactical failure, but because of material mathematics. Even victory was unsustainable. Germany was spending irreplaceable assets to achieve temporary gains. The Soviets and Western allies were spending renewable resources from industrial bases that Germany could not match or destroy. Back in Germany, propaganda continued to insist otherwise. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, delivered his famous Total War speech in February 1943 at the Berlin Sportpalast, calling on Germans to mobilize completely for victory. The speech was brilliant theatre, rousing thousands to ecstatic support, but it contained a fundamental lie. Germany was already fully mobilized. There were no hidden reserves of industrial capacity to unlock. Total war had been Germany's reality since 1939. The problem was not German effort. The problem was American capacity. Goebbels himself knew this. His private diary entries from 1943 reveal a man increasingly aware that Germany faced industrial odds it could not overcome. But public statements required optimism, required denial, required the maintenance of belief in ultimate victory. So the propaganda continued, describing American production claims as Jewish exaggeration, while German cities burned under Allied bombing campaigns that would have been impossible without American industrial might. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this dual reality took its toll. German leadership became increasingly detached from operational realities, making decisions based on what should be true rather than what was true. Resources were allocated to wonder weapons, jet fighters, and ballistic missiles that might restore German technological advantage, while basic production of conventional arms fell behind Allied output by ever wider margins. Rommel watched this deterioration with growing alarm. After spending months inspecting Atlantic wall defenses, he became convinced that the Allied invasion, when it came, would succeed not through brilliant tactics, but through overwhelming force. He tried to communicate this to Hitler in personal meetings, but found the Führer uninterested in defensive planning that assumed Allied superiority in any dimension. In one particularly frustrating exchange in March 1944, Rommel attempted to explain that Allied landing forces would arrive with enormous logistical support, essentially bringing a complete supply system with them. Hitler interrupted. "They cannot supply armies across open beaches. It's logistically impossible. We proved this in our planning for invading England. They will need ports and we will deny them ports. Their offensive will stall within days." "Mein Führer," Rommel replied carefully. "The Americans have developed specialized landing craft and floating harbors. Intelligence reports reflect enemy deception," Hitler stated. "They want us to believe in phantom capabilities. The American soldier is inexperienced, undisciplined. Their equipment is quantity over quality. We destroyed them at Kasserine Pass. We will destroy them on the beaches of France." Rommel fell silent. Kasserine Pass, his single tactical victory against American forces, had become, in Hitler's mind, proof of American weakness rather than a warning about American resilience. The battle had achieved the opposite of its intended effect, confirming Hitler's prejudices rather than challenging them. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Normandy coast. Rommel is not there. He is driven to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday, convinced that weather conditions make an invasion impossible for several days. The call reaches him at 7:30 in the morning. Allied forces are landing across 5 beaches, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of men. The invasion he is prepared for, the invasion he warned about, the invasion Hitler insisted could not succeed, has begun. Rommel drives back. Immediately, racing through French countryside toward his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. The journey takes 10 hours, delayed by Allied fighter bombers that control the skies so completely that German movement, even far behind the lines, is dangerous. When he finally arrives, the reports are devastating, not because the German defenders have collapsed, but because of what the Allies have brought with them. The beaches are not merely landing zones, they are harbors. Allied engineers are assembling enormous floating piers called mulberries, complete structures towed across the English Channel in sections and anchored offshore. Ships unload directly onto these artificial ports in waters where no natural harbor exists. The logistics system that Hitler insisted was impossible is functioning exactly as Allied planners designed it. And the supplies. Officers returning from forward positions describe supply dumps growing by the hour. Mountains of ammunition crates, fuel barrels stacked in endless rows, food supplies, medical equipment, spare parts, vehicles. American trucks roll off landing craft and immediately begin shuttling material inland. The scale makes Kasserine Pass look like a small training exercise. Rommel watches the reports accumulate and understands that he is witnessing the culmination of everything he tried to warn Hitler about for the past 18 months. This is not an army. This is an industrial system, mobile and self-sustaining. The Americans have not solved the problem of supplying forces across open beaches. They have eliminated the problem by bringing their own port with them. Within days, specific details emerge that make the situation even more hopeless. Allied forces are landing pre-packaged supplies in standardized containers. There is no confusion, no shortage, no improvisation. Everything has been calculated, manufactured, and shipped according to plans developed months earlier. When a tank company needs fuel, supply trucks arrive with exact quantities in standardized containers. When artillery units require ammunition, it arrives in precisely the calibers needed. The contrast with German logistics is stark. Wehrmacht supply trains struggle to reach the front through bombed rail lines, moving at night to avoid Allied aircraft. When supplies arrive, they are often mismatched to actual needs. Units receive ammunition for weapons they do not have, fuel for vehicle types not present in their formation. The German system depends on skilled logistics officers improvising solutions. The Allied system depends on having planned so thoroughly that improvisation is unnecessary. By mid-June, Rommel makes one final attempt to communicate reality to Hitler. He requests a personal meeting, traveling to Berchtesgaden to deliver his assessment face-to-face. The meeting takes place on June 17th, 11 days after D-Day. Rommel brings detailed reports, casualty figures, assessments of Allied strength. He explains that German forces are being systematically ground down not through tactical defeats but through attrition. For every Allied soldier killed, 3 more arrive. For every Allied tank destroyed, 5 more land. Hitler listens with visible impatience. When Rommel finishes, the Führer's response ignores every specific point raised. The enemy has landed, yes. This was expected. Now we will destroy them. Our panzer reserves will drive them back into the sea. This is the decisive battle. Victory here means victory in the war. Mein Führer, Rommel says carefully, the enemy possesses overwhelming material superiority. Our panzer reserves are being destroyed by Allied air power before they reach the battlefield. We're fighting not merely an army, but an entire industrial nation that has transported itself to France. Hitler's expression hardens. You have become infected with defeatism, Herr Feldmarschall. The enemy wants you to believe in their invincibility. This is psychological warfare. Their production statistics are exaggerated by their Jewish-controlled media. American soldiers are poorly trained and lack fighting spirit. We proved this in Africa. We will prove it again in France. With respect, Mein Führer, what we face in Normandy is fundamentally different from Africa. The scale of supply, the scale is a mirage. Hitler interrupts sharply. They concentrate everything for the initial assault to create an impression of limitless resources. Once their offensive exhausts itself, we will counterattack. This has always been our strategy. Bleed the enemy, then strike. Rommel tries once more. The Allied ability to replace losses may exceed our ability to inflict them. If we cannot achieve decisive results quickly, the mathematics of attrition. Mathematics? Hitler's voice rises. War is not mathematics. War is will against will. The German soldier, properly led and properly supplied, is superior to any enemy. We do not need more tanks than the enemy. We need better tanks, better tactics, better leadership. This defeatist obsession with enemy numbers is precisely what they want. You disappoint me. Rommel. The meeting ends shortly after. Rommel returns to France, knowing that nothing he has said has altered Hitler's understanding. The Führer has constructed a reality where German willpower can overcome Allied industrial capacity, where tactics matter more than logistics, where belief in victory creates victory regardless of material circumstances. But the material circumstances are overwhelming. By the end of June, Allied forces have landed over 850,000 men in Normandy. Supply dumps contain enough ammunition to sustain combat operations for months. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, begins operating in August, delivering 7,000 tons of supplies daily to advancing armies. American trucks, built by the tens of thousands, form an endless chain from beach to front line. German forces fight with desperate skill, making the Allies pay for every kilometer. But they cannot stop what is essentially an industrial machine grinding forward. When German units destroy Allied tanks, replacements appear within days. When ammunition runs low for Allied artillery, new shipments arrive overnight. The war has become exactly what Rommel warned about, a contest between German tactical excellence and American industrial capacity, and industrial capacity is winning. By July, Rommel has reached his conclusion. Germany cannot win this war. The mathematics are inescapable. He begins meeting secretly with German officers who share his assessment, discussing possibilities for ending the conflict before Germany is completely destroyed. These conversations are careful, coded, treasonous. They speak of approaching the Western Allies for negotiations, of removing Hitler from power if necessary, of saving what remains of Germany. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers attempts to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The plot fails. Hitler survives with minor injuries. In the subsequent investigation, Rommel's name surfaces among those who had knowledge of anti-Hitler conspiracies, though his direct involvement in the assassination attempt remains unclear. The evidence against him is circumstantial, but sufficient. He had spoken too openly about the impossibility of victory. He had advocated for negotiations with the Western Allies. He had questioned the Führer's judgment. In the paranoid atmosphere following the assassination attempt, these conversations are proof enough of disloyalty. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrive at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They carry a message from Hitler. Rommel can face trial for treason, with the certainty of execution and disgrace for his family, or he can take poison, die as a hero, and be buried with full military honors. His family will be protected, his reputation preserved. Rommel chooses poison. He says goodbye to his wife and son, climbs into a staff car with the two generals, and swallows cyanide. The official announcement declares that he died of injuries sustained when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft months earlier. He is given a state funeral. Hitler sends a wreath. The man who had tried to warn Germany about American industrial reality dies, branded a traitor, not for being wrong, but for being right at a moment when truth was intolerable. Meanwhile, the war continues according to the logic Rommel had described. American factories produce 85,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany produces 39,000. American shipyards launch merchant vessels faster than U-boats can sink them. American automotive plants turn out trucks by the tens of thousands, giving Allied armies mobility that German forces, increasingly dependent on horses for transport, cannot match. The Red Ball Express eventually operates 7,000 trucks moving supplies across France. American engineering battalions construct the Bailey bridges that allow tanks to cross rivers within hours of arrival. Petroleum pipelines are laid across France, pumping fuel directly from ships to advancing armies. Everything Rommel witnessed at Kasserine Pass, everything he tried to explain to Hitler, manifests on a continental scale. By December 1944, Hitler makes one final attempt to reverse Germany's fortunes. The Battle of the Bulge, a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, aims to split Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. The attack achieves initial surprise, creating a dangerous salient in Allied lines. For a brief moment, it appears that German tactical brilliance might still matter, but the Allied response illustrates exactly why it does not. Within days, American forces redirect entire divisions to the threatened sector. Supply convoys reroute automatically. Artillery ammunition arrives in quantities sufficient to fire continuously for weeks. The weather clears, and Allied aircraft grounded during the initial German assault fill the skies in numbers that make German movement impossible during daylight. The offensive collapses not through decisive defeat, but through exhaustion. German forces run out of fuel, ammunition stocks deplete, replacement soldiers and equipment cannot reach forward units. Meanwhile, American losses are replaced within days from reserves that seem limitless. A German officer captured during the battle tells his interrogators, "We knew we could not win. We were told that if we captured American fuel dumps, we could continue the offensive. But there are always more American fuel dumps. You build them faster than we can capture them." This is the essence of what Rommel tried to explain and Hitler refused to accept. Modern industrial warfare is not won through tactical brilliance or superior willpower. It is won through production capacity, logistics systems, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. Germany excelled at warfare as it had existed in previous centuries. America had invented warfare for the industrial age. The final act plays out over the next 4 months. Allied armies advance into Germany from west and east. German cities burn under bombing campaigns that drop more tonnage of explosives in single nights than had been used in entire campaigns of previous wars. Every bomb is American-made or British-made, delivered by American-built or British-built aircraft, guided by industrial systems that Germany cannot match or destroy. Hitler, in his bunker beneath Berlin, continues to issue orders based on armies that no longer exist, counting on wonder weapons that cannot be produced in sufficient numbers, believing until the end that willpower can overcome material reality. He takes his own life on April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces, equipped with American trucks and eating American rations, fight through the streets above him. Germany surrenders unconditionally on May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ends, not with a climactic battle, but with simple collapse. German forces have not been defeated tactically. They have been smothered logistically, buried under an avalanche of Allied production that continued growing until the moment of surrender. The final statistics tell the story Rommel tried to communicate. During the war, America produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and enough other material to equip not only its own forces, but also substantial portions of British, Soviet, and other Allied armies. Germany, fighting desperately on multiple fronts with its industrial base under constant attack, produced roughly 1/3 those numbers. The gap was not just quantitative, it was qualitative in unexpected ways. American standardization meant that spare parts were interchangeable across thousands of vehicles. American mass production meant that every soldier had boots that fit, uniforms that were warm, food that was adequate. These mundane logistics mattered more than tactical genius or warrior spirit. German veterans, in the years after the war, would often speak of American material superiority with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. They had been taught that Germans were inherently superior soldiers, that training and discipline would overcome any disadvantage. The reality they encountered was an enemy that did not need to be superior soldier for soldier, because it could field 10 soldiers for every German, each adequately equipped, supplied, and supported. One former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed decades later, summarized the experience. "We were excellent soldiers, fighting an excellent system. The system won. It always does." This was the truth Rommel recognized at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. This was the reality he tried to communicate to Hitler over the following 18 months. And this was the knowledge that made him dangerous to a regime that could not acknowledge material reality without admitting ideological bankruptcy. Hitler called accurate assessments of American industrial capacity Jewish propaganda, not merely as an insult, but as a theological statement. In Nazi ideology, Jews were the source of deception and corruption. To accept that American production statistics were real would require accepting that Jewish-influenced systems could outproduce Aryan ones, that multiracial democracy could organize more effectively than racial dictatorship, that the entire ideological foundation of National Socialism was wrong. So the statistics were denied, the warnings were dismissed, and officers who spoke truth were labeled defeatists or traitors. Germany fought a war against industrial reality with ideological fantasy, and the outcome was never in doubt once America fully mobilized. The irony is that Hitler had access to the truth from multiple sources: Rommel's reports from Africa, Speer's industrial assessments, Dönitz's naval calculations, intelligence from neutral countries. Even captured Allied documents sometimes fell into German hands, containing supply figures and production schedules that confirmed everything German field commanders had observed. All of it was dismissed as exaggeration, deception, or defeatism. The moment Germany realized America was built different was not a single moment. It was a series of moments, recognized by different people at different times, each realization suppressed or ignored until it became too late to matter. Rommel saw it at Kasserine Pass. Speer saw it in production statistics. Dönitz saw it in shipping figures. German soldiers saw it every time they faced an enemy that could lose today and come back stronger tomorrow. But the one person who needed to see it, who had the power to alter German strategy based on that recognition, refused to look. Hitler dismissed every warning as propaganda until the Red Army was fighting through the streets of Berlin and American forces were uncovering the concentration camps that revealed what Germany had become. In the end, the war was decided not by the battles that historians remember, but by the industrial capacity that made those battles possible. D-Day succeeded not because of brilliant tactics, but because Allied logistics supported it. The Battle of the Bulge failed not because of German mistakes, but because American supply lines held. Berlin fell not through Soviet military genius, but through material overwhelming force that Germany could not match. Rommel understood this in 1943. He tried to warn his superiors. He was called a defeatist, forced from command, and eventually given a choice between poison and treason trial. He chose poison, and Germany fought on for another 6 months, achieving nothing except additional destruction. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Somewhere over the shattered landscape of Bavaria, April 1945, a P-47 Thunderbolt, designated Ter Sugar 73, streaked low across fields still scarred by tank treads and artillery craters. First Lieutenant James Harrington, 23 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had flown 72 combat missions without so much as a scratch on his aircraft. But today, on what should have been a routine reconnaissance sweep, his engine coughed once, then twice, and the oil pressure gauge dropped like a stone. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, normally a mechanical heartbeat of reliability, was hemorrhaging oil from a fractured line he couldn't see but could smell. Hot, metallic, acrid, he had maybe 10 minutes before seizure. Below him, the German countryside unfolded in a patchwork of devastation and desperate normalcy. Smoke columns rose from distant towns. Displaced persons trudged along roads with everything they owned piled onto carts, and scattered between them, American forward positions marked by olive-drab tents and the white stars painted on every surface. Harrington keyed his radio. "Falcon Base, this is Ter Sugar 73, engine failure, making emergency landing at nearest forward strip." The response crackled back almost instantly. "Copy 73. Nearest strip is Ansbach forward, 3 miles northwest your position. Winds light, runway clear." He banked hard, dropping altitude fast. The Thunderbolt was a beast of a machine, built to take punishment, but it demanded respect when wounded. At 400 feet, he spotted the airstrip, a former Luftwaffe training field hastily repaired by Army engineers. Pierced steel planking stretched across mud surrounded by sandbagged revetments and a handful of tents. He brought the plane in hard. Tires screamed against metal. The tail skipped once, settled, and he rolled to a stop near a fuel truck, smoke trailing from the cowling. Ground crew sprinted toward him, fire extinguishers ready. Harrington killed the engine, popped the canopy, and climbed out, legs shaking from adrenaline. "Jesus, Lieutenant!" a mechanic shouted, pointing at the engine. "You're lucky that didn't lock up at altitude." Harrington nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the April chill. He'd survived. That was enough for now. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Harrington didn't know, as he stood beside his wounded aircraft, inhaling the smell of burnt oil and spring mud, was that 200 yards away, behind a collapsed stone wall, a pair of eyes watched him. A girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dressed in a coat 3 sizes too large, her face smudged with dirt, her hair matted beneath a threadbare scarf. She had been watching the American air base for 3 days now, learning the routines, the shift changes, the moments when soldiers disappeared into tents or gathered around fires. She was calculating, not with malice, but with the cold arithmetic of survival. The airbase had food, she had none. Her name was Annalisa Kohler, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in weeks. Speaking required trust, and trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had lost her mother in the firestorm that consumed Würzburg 2 months earlier, a Royal Air Force raid on March 16th, 1945, that killed 5,000 civilians in less than 20 minutes. Her father, a Wehrmacht soldier, had been declared missing in action on the Eastern Front in 1943. She was alone, and alone in the collapsing Reich meant dead unless you learned to adapt. The Americans had arrived in Ansbach on April 20th. She remembered the date because it had been the Führer's birthday, a day that once meant parades and flags and children singing. This year, it meant tanks rolling through the streets and white bedsheets hanging from windows. The Nazis had fled. The SS had vanished, and in their place came the Americans, with their endless supplies, their casual abundance, their incomprehensible wealth. She had watched them unload crates of food, boxes of cigarettes, drums of fuel. She had smelled meat cooking over their fires, real meat, not the sawdust bread or nettle soup that had sustained her for months. She knew the penalty for stealing. The Germans would have shot her. The Americans, she wasn't sure. But hunger had a way of making uncertainty feel like a reasonable risk. She waited until dusk, when the light turned grey and the sentries rotated shifts. Then she moved. Low, fast, using the rubble as cover. She slipped beneath a gap in the wire fence where a supply truck had bent the posts earlier that day. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the malnutrition that had robbed her muscles of strength. She reached the supply tent, canvas flaps tied loosely. Inside, wooden crates stacked waist-high. She ducked inside, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she would know it when she saw it. Her fingers found a crate marked with a red cross. Medical supplies. Useless. Another crate. This one unmarked. She pried at the lid, splinters digging into her palms. Inside, tins. Canned meat. She grabbed 2, shoving them into the deep pockets of her coat. Then she saw it. A wooden box, smaller than the others, stenciled with words she couldn't read. She opened it. Chocolate bars, American D rations, dark brown, wrapped in wax paper. She had forgotten what chocolate tasted like. She took 4 bars, stuffing them alongside the tins. Her coat sagged with the weight. She turned to leave, and that's when the flashlight beam hit her face. "Hey, stop right there!" The voice was sharp, American, male. She froze. The beam didn't move. For a heartbeat, neither did she. Then instinct took over. She ran. Boots, pounded behind her. Shouts erupted. She didn't look back. She sprinted toward the fence, her coat flapping, the stolen food weighing her down. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed. She was 30 feet from the wire when a hand grabbed her shoulder and yanked her backward. She fell hard, the contents of her pockets scattering across the dirt, cans rolled, chocolate bars tumbled into the mud. She looked up, expecting a rifle barrel, expecting a blow. Instead, she saw a face, young, tired, confused. The soldier who had grabbed her was barely older than a boy himself. He knelt beside her, breathing hard, and for a moment neither of them moved. He looked at the scattered food, then at her, then at her hands, still clutching one chocolate bar with the desperation of someone who had forgotten what it meant to hold something valuable. "Jesus," he muttered, "you're just a kid." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't anger, it was something closer to shock. He stood, pulling her to her feet. She didn't resist. Resistance required energy she no longer had. He picked up the cans, the chocolate bars, and placed them back into her pockets. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He gestured toward the fence. "Go, get out of here before someone else sees you." She still didn't move. He sighed, reached into his own pocket and pulled out another chocolate bar. He pressed it into her hand. "Here, take it. Now go." This time she understood. She ran. Not toward the fence, but away from the light into the shadows, clutching the stolen food and the unexpected gift. Behind her, the soldier watched until she disappeared into the ruins. Then he turned back toward the base, shaking his head, wondering if he'd just made a mistake or the only decent choice he had. Lieutenant Harrington heard about the incident the next morning at the pilot's briefing. A girl, maybe 10 years old, caught stealing rations, let go by a sentry who claimed she looked like she hadn't eaten in weeks. The base commander, a weary captain named Reeves, had simply waved it off. "Half the kids in this country are starving," he said. "We're not the Gestapo. Just tighten security and move on." But the story stuck with Harrington. He had a daughter back home, Emma. She was 8 years old, blonde hair, freckles, a smile that could light up a room. He carried her photograph in his flight jacket, tucked beside his heart. Every time he flew, he thought about her. Every time he landed, he thanked God he'd live to see her again. And now, hearing about this German girl, this enemy child, stealing food just to survive, something in his chest tightened. That evening, he walked the perimeter of the base. He didn't know what he was looking for. Closure, maybe. Understanding. He found himself standing near the collapsed stone wall, the place where sentries had reported seeing movement. He scanned the ruins. Nothing. Then, just as he turned to leave, he saw her, crouched behind a pile of bricks, watching him with the same unblinking intensity she'd shown the airbase. She didn't run this time. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she'd calculated that running wouldn't help. Harrington raised his hands slowly, palms out. Universal language. No threat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a K-ration tin. Canned cheese. He set it on the ground and stepped back. The girl didn't move. He took another step back, then another. Finally, she darted forward, grabbed the tin, and retreated. She opened it with her teeth, tearing at the metal lid until her fingers bled. She ate with the same frantic desperation he'd heard described. Not tasting. Surviving. Harrington watched her for a long moment. Then he spoke, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the tone. "I have a daughter," he said quietly. "Her name is Emma. She's about your age. And if this war had gone differently, if the bombs had fallen on Iowa instead of Germany, she'd be you right now, hungry, alone." "Scared?" The girl stopped chewing. She looked at him. Not with trust, but with the faintest flicker of something that might, one day, become it. Harrington pulled out his wallet. Inside, the photograph of Emma. He held it up. "This is her. Emma, my daughter." The girl stared at the photograph. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, just slightly. Harrington had an idea. It was impulsive, maybe foolish, but war had a way of making foolish ideas feel necessary. "What if," he said aloud, more to himself than to her, "what if I could help you? Not just with food, with something more." He didn't know yet what that meant, but he would figure it out, because in that moment, standing in the ruins of a country that had tried to destroy his own, looking at a child who was paying the price for decisions made by men in distant rooms, he realized something. The war wasn't just fought with bombs and bullets. It was fought with choices, small human choices, and this was his. Over the next 2 weeks, Harrington returned to the wall every evening. Each time, he brought food, a tin of meat, a canteen of water, a blanket scavenged from the medical tent. The girl, Annalisa, though he didn't know her name yet, appeared each time. Slowly, cautiously, the ritual became routine. She stopped flinching when he approached. She started eating in front of him instead of running away first. He talked to her, rambling about Iowa, about his wife Margaret, about Emma and her love of drawing pictures of horses. Annalise didn't respond, but she listened, and one evening, after nearly 3 weeks of silence, she spoke. A single word, barely audible. "Danke." "Thank you," Harrington smiled. "You're welcome," he said. Then carefully he asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. "Annalisa." "Annalisa," he repeated. "That's a beautiful name." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. He'd been carrying it for days, waiting for the right moment. It was a letter, written in careful block letters by Emma. With Margaret's help, the Army Postal Service allowed families to send mail to servicemen, and those servicemen could sometimes arrange for letters to be delivered to civilians in occupied zones, especially displaced children. It was part of the broader humanitarian effort. "This," Harrington said, holding up the letter, "is from my daughter, Emma. She heard about you. Well, not you, specifically, but about kids like you. And she wanted to write." He handed the letter to Annalisa. She took it, unfolding it slowly. The paper was clean, white, impossibly precious. The ink was neat. There were drawings in the margins. Horses, a house, a smiling sun. The words were in English, which Annalise couldn't read. But she traced the letters with her finger, feeling the texture of a world so far removed from hers, it might as well have been another planet. Harrington pulled out another piece of paper. This one was blank, and a pencil. "If you want," he said gently, "you could write back. I can translate, or just draw something. Anything. I think Emma would like that." Annalisa stared at the blank page, then at the photograph of Emma, which Harrington had left with her the week before. Slowly, carefully, she began to draw. Not words. She didn't have the strength for words yet, but shapes, a house, a tree, a small figure standing beside it. When she finished, she handed it back to Harrington. He looked at the drawing. It was simple, almost childlike, but in the margins, barely visible, she had written something, a single word in German. "Freundin," friend. The letter exchange began as a small act of kindness. Lieutenant Harrington had no grand vision, no sense that he was building something permanent. He simply thought his daughter might enjoy having a pen pal, and that a German girl alone in the rubble might benefit from knowing someone, somewhere, cared whether she lived or died. The first few letters were brief. Emma wrote about her school, her cat named Whiskers, the elm tree in their backyard. Margaret, Harrington's wife, helped translate simple German phrases. "Wie geht es dir? How are you? Ich hoffe, Du bist sicher. I hope you are safe. Anneliese's responses were even briefer. Short sentences, simple drawings, a flower, a bird, once a crude sketch of an airplane that looked remarkably like Harrington's P-47. She was learning to trust the ritual. Every 3 days, Harrington would appear at the wall. He'd bring food always, but now he also brought letters. And slowly, impossibly, Anneliese began to believe that perhaps the world hadn't entirely abandoned her. By mid-May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The fighting stopped, but the chaos didn't. Millions of displaced persons flooded the roads. Refugees, former prisoners, slave laborers freed from camps, soldiers trying to get home. The Allied military government struggled to process them all. Ansbach Forward Air Base transitioned from a combat position to a logistics hub, managing supply lines for occupation forces. Harrington's unit received orders to redeploy. Some pilots would go home. Others would transfer to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan still raged. Harrington drew the latter. He had 2 weeks before he shipped out. 2 weeks to figure out what would happen to Anneliese. He couldn't just leave her in the ruins, but he also couldn't take her with him. Military regulations were explicit. No unauthorized civilians could travel with military personnel, especially not children of enemy nationals. He went to Captain Reeves. The conversation was tense. "Sir, there's a German girl, an orphan. I've been helping her. She needs to be placed somewhere safe." Reeves rubbed his temples. He looked exhausted. "Lieutenant, there are thousands of orphans. We're doing what we can, but the displaced persons camps are overwhelmed. Most of them are glorified tent cities with minimal food and no heating. Conditions are bad." Harrington persisted. "What about a local family, someone who could take her in?" Reeves sighed. "The German civilians are barely surviving themselves. Most families have lost sons, fathers. They're dealing with their own trauma. Asking them to take in another mouth to feed is asking a lot." "Then what happens to her?" Harrington asked, his voice tight. Reeves didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, "She'll be processed like everyone else. Registered, sent to a DP camp. Maybe if she's lucky, someone will adopt her eventually. But honestly, most of these kids will spend the next year or two in camps until the Red Cross can sort everything out." It wasn't good enough. Harrington knew it. Reeves knew it. But the machinery of war and occupation moved slowly, and individual stories, no matter how compelling, got lost in the bureaucratic grinding. That evening, Harrington returned to the wall. Anneliese was there as always. She'd grown slightly stronger over the past month. Her face had filled out a little. The tremors in her hands had stopped. She could smile now, though it was still rare and fragile. He sat down beside her. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he pulled out Emma's latest letter. This one was longer. Emma had written about summer coming, about planning to go swimming in the creek, about missing her father. At the end, she'd drawn a picture of the two of them, Emma and Anneliese, holding hands beneath a rainbow. Harrington translated the letter aloud, his voice catching on certain phrases. When he finished, Anneliese looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I have to leave soon," he said gently. "My unit is going to the Pacific, to fight the Japanese." Anneliese's face fell. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the routine, to the small island of safety he represented. "But," Harrington continued, "I'm not going to just leave you here. I've arranged for you to be registered with the Displaced Persons Office. They'll find you a place, a family, hopefully, or at least a safe camp." She nodded slowly, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She'd been in camps before, refugee camps, places where people disappeared, where sickness spread, where children learned to fight over scraps. Harrington reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside were 5 letters, all from Emma. "These," he said, "are for you. Emma will keep writing. I'll make sure the letters get to you, wherever you end up, and I want you to write back. Can you do that?" Anneliese nodded, clutching the bundle to her chest. "And one more thing," Harrington added. He pulled out a second photograph. This one showed his entire family, Margaret, Emma, and himself, taken the previous Christmas. Everyone was smiling. It looked like a scene from another world. "I want you to have this, so you remember you're not alone." Anneliese took the photograph with trembling hands. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Harrington had met her, she cried, not the silent tears of exhaustion or pain, but deep, shaking sobs, the kind that only come when someone finally feels safe enough to break. Harrington pulled her into an awkward hug. She buried her face in his jacket, and he held her while she wept, this small German girl who had survived firestorms and starvation, who had stolen chocolate and learned to trust an enemy soldier who now clung to him as if he were the last solid thing in a world that had turned to smoke. When the sobs finally subsided, she pulled back and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. She looked up at him and spoke, her voice hoarse but clear. "Danke, Herr Harrington. Danke für alles. Thank you for everything." He smiled. "You're going to be okay, Anneliese. I promise. You're stronger than you know." 3 days later, Harrington escorted Anneliese to the Displaced Persons Registration Center in Ansbach. It was housed in a former Wehrmacht barracks, now repurposed by the Allied military government. Inside, the halls echoed with the sounds of bureaucracy, typewriters clacking, file cabinets slamming, voices calling out names and numbers. Anneliese gripped Harrington's hand tightly as they waited in line. When their turn came, a harried Red Cross worker took her information. Name: Anneliese Kohler. Age: estimated 10 years old. Place of origin: Würzburg. Parents: deceased. Status: orphan. The worker stamped a form and handed Harrington a slip of paper. "She'll be assigned to a children's group home in Nuremberg. Transport leaves tomorrow morning at 0800. "A group home?" Harrington asked. "What's that like?" The worker shrugged. "Better than a tent city. It's a former school building, clean beds, regular meals, about 50 other kids, run by German staff, supervised by Allied forces. She'll be safe there." It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Harrington knelt down to Anneliese's level. "You're going to Nuremberg. It's a city not far from here. There will be other children, people who will take care of you. And I'll make sure Emma's letters find you." Anneliese nodded, but her grip on his hand didn't loosen. "Will I see you again?" she asked in halting German. Harrington hesitated. He wanted to lie, to promise something he couldn't deliver. Instead, he chose honesty. "I don't know. The war isn't over everywhere, but I'll write to you. And Emma will write to you. And no matter what happens, you'll always have us. Okay?" She nodded again, and this time she let go of his hand. The next morning, Harrington watched from a distance as Anneliese boarded a canvas-covered truck with a dozen other children. She climbed into the back, clutching her small bundle of belongings, the letters, the photograph, a blanket, a tin of crackers. Just before the truck pulled away, she turned and looked back. Their eyes met across the crowded motor pool. Harrington raised his hand in a small wave. She waved back. Then the truck lurched forward, and she was gone. Lieutenant Harrington shipped out for the Pacific Theater on June 2, 1945. He spent the next 3 months flying missions over Japan, supporting the island-hopping campaign. He was in Okinawa when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was still there when Japan surrendered on August 15th, and when the war finally, truly ended, he felt not triumph, but exhaustion. He'd been fighting for 4 years. He was 23 years old and felt 50. He returned home to Cedar Rapids in October 1945. The homecoming was everything he dreamed of during the long nights overseas. Margaret waiting at the train station, Emma running into his arms, the smell of his mother's cooking, the quiet safety of his own bed. But even in the midst of reunion, he thought about Anneliese. He'd written to the group home in Nuremberg before leaving Germany, providing his home address and asking them to forward any letters from the girl. He'd told Emma to keep writing, and she had. Every week, without fail, Emma composed letters filled with stories about school, friends, drawings, and questions about what life was like in Germany. The first letter from Anneliese arrived in December 1945. It was brief, written in uncertain German script, but the Red Cross had included a translation. She was safe. The group home was crowded but clean. She shared a room with 5 other girls. There was school during the day, chores in the afternoon. The food was simple but regular. She missed Harrington. She thanked Emma for the letters. She'd drawn a picture of the two of them, just like Emma's rainbow drawing, holding hands beneath a sky full of stars. Emma was overjoyed. She pinned the drawing to her bedroom wall and immediately wrote back. And so the correspondence continued, month after month, letter after letter, a lifeline stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting 2 girls who had never met, but who had become, through the strange alchemy of war and compassion, something like sisters. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The letters continued through 1946, 47, 48. As the years passed, the tone shifted. Anneliese's letters grew longer, more confident. Her German became more refined as she received proper schooling. She wrote about her dreams of becoming a teacher. She wrote about the other children in the home, some of whom had been adopted, others who remained. She wrote about the slow rebuilding of Nuremberg, the rubble being cleared, the new buildings rising. And she wrote always about her gratitude to the Harrington family. Emma, meanwhile, grew from a child into a teenager. Her letters evolved from simple stories about pets and school to more complex reflections on friendship, identity, the weight of history. She asked Anneliese about the war, about what it was like to lose everything. And Anneliese, in turn, answered with an honesty that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. In one letter from 1949, Anneliese wrote, "I think about the day your father found me. I was so hungry I would have eaten poison if it meant filling my stomach. But he stopped me. He saved my life. And then he gave me something more precious than food. He gave me hope. He showed me that even enemies can be kind, that even in war, humanity survives." By 1950, the group home in Nuremberg began closing down. The immediate post-war crisis had eased. Many children had been reunited with distant relatives or adopted by German families recovering from the devastation. Anneliese, now 15 years old, was placed with a foster family in Munich. A widow named Frau Schneider and her adult daughter, they ran a small bakery. The arrangement was practical. Anneliese would help in the bakery in exchange for room, board, and a chance to finish her education. The letters to Iowa continued. Now Anneliese wrote about learning to bake bread, about the rhythm of waking before dawn to prepare dough, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from simple ingredients. She wrote about her foster family, who were kind but reserved, still grieving their own losses, and she wrote about her plans for the future. She wanted to finish school, maybe attend university, become a teacher, as she'd dreamed. Emma, now 16, wrote back about her own plans. She was thinking about college, maybe studying art or literature. She was dating a boy named Thomas, though she wasn't sure if it was serious. And she wrote always about how much the letters from Anneliese meant to her, how they had shaped her understanding of the world, of empathy, of what it meant to be connected to someone across vast distances and differences. James Harrington, watching his daughter grow into a thoughtful, compassionate young woman, often reflected on that spring in Germany. He'd been 23 years old, scared, exhausted, desperate to survive and get home. And yet, in the midst of all that fear and chaos, he'd made a choice, a small choice, to help a starving child, to connect her with his daughter, to refuse to see her as just another casualty of war. And that choice had rippled outward, shaping not just Anneliese's life, but Emma's as well. It had taught his daughter that people were not defined by the flags they were born under, but by the choices they made when it mattered most. In 1953, Anneliese graduated from secondary school. She was 18 years old, bright, determined, and profoundly aware of how close she had come to a very different fate. She enrolled in a teacher training program in Munich, working part-time in the bakery to support herself. Her letters to Emma became less frequent, not from lack of care, but from the simple demands of adulthood. Both young women were building lives, pursuing dreams, stepping into futures that once seemed impossible. Emma graduated from high school in 1952 and attended the University of Iowa. She studied education, inspired in part by Anneliese's dream of teaching. In 1956, she married Thomas, the boy she'd written about years earlier. James Harrington walked her down the aisle, and, as he did, he thought about another young woman across the ocean, a woman he hadn't seen in over a decade, but who remained, in some fundamental way, part of his family. In 1957, Anneliese sent a letter announcing her own engagement. She was marrying a fellow teacher named Klaus, a kind man who had lost his father in the war and understood the weight of history they all carried. The wedding would be small, she wrote, just close friends and her foster family, but she wished the Harringtons could be there. She considered them, after all, her American family. James, Margaret, and Emma sent a wedding gift, a set of fine linens, carefully chosen and shipped across the Atlantic. And Emma wrote a letter that brought Anneliese to tears. "I have never met you in person," Emma wrote, "but you are one of the most important people in my life. You taught me that friendship doesn't require proximity, that love can cross oceans and languages and histories, that the world is full of people just like us, trying to build lives and find meaning in the rubble. I hope one day we can meet. I hope I can hug you and tell you in person what I'm telling you now. You are my sister. Not by blood, but by something stronger. By choice." The years continued to pass. Letters became less frequent as both women raised families of their own. Emma had 3 children. Anneliese had 2. But even as the rhythm of correspondence slowed, the bond remained. Christmas cards were exchanged. Photographs were sent. Small updates, births, deaths, milestones were shared. In 1972, James Harrington suffered a heart attack. He survived, but it was a warning. He was 50 years old, and the years of war stress, combined with the normal wear of life, had taken their toll. As he recovered, he thought often about Germany, about Anneliese, about the choices that had seemed so small at the time, but had echoed so loudly across the decades. He wrote to Anneliese directly for the first time in years. The letter was long, reflective. He told her about his life after the war, about the struggles to readjust, about the nightmares that had taken years to fade, and he told her something he'd never quite articulated before. That saving her had saved him too. That in the midst of a war that had demanded he see people as enemies, targets, threats, she had reminded him that his humanity was a choice, and that choice had made all the difference. Anneliese's response arrived 6 weeks later. She wrote about her own journey, about the trauma that still lived in quiet corners of her memory, about the children she taught and the stories she tried to pass on, and she wrote about the photograph he'd given her, the one of his family at Christmas 1944. She still had it, she said. It sat on her mantel. Her own children had asked about it countless times, and she'd told them the story. About the American pilot who had seen a starving enemy child and chosen compassion, about the girl in Iowa who had written letters to a stranger and made her feel less alone, about how, even in the darkest times, people could choose light. "You saved my life," she wrote. "But more than that, you gave me a reason to believe life was worth saving. You showed me that the world could be kind, and I have spent every day since trying to pass that kindness forward to my students, to my children, to anyone who needs to hear that they are not alone." James Harrington passed away in 1983 at the age of 61. His death was peaceful, surrounded by family. At his funeral, Emma read a letter she'd received from Anneliese. In it, Anneliese described her father as one of the great heroes of her life, not because he'd flown 72 combat missions or shot down enemy planes, but because he'd seen a child stealing chocolate and chosen mercy, because he'd connected two girls across an ocean and shown them both that humanity was stronger than hate. The correspondence between Emma and Anneliese continued for another 3 decades. They finally met in person in 1998, when Emma, now in her 60s, traveled to Germany with her husband. The reunion was emotional. 2 elderly women embracing in a Munich cafe, crying and laughing, speaking in a mixture of English and German, bridging a gap that had existed for over 50 years. They spent a week together, walking through the rebuilt streets of Nuremberg, visiting the site of the old group home, sharing stories and memories. Anneliese. Kohler, now Anneliese Weber, passed away in 2008 at the age of 73. Emma Harrington, now Emma Thompson, spoke at her funeral via video link, too frail to travel, but determined to honor the woman who had been her pen pal, her friend, her sister, for over 60 years. "We were children of war," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears, "separated by geography and circumstance, but we were connected by something more powerful than all the bombs and bullets ever fired. We were connected by choice. My father's choice to see humanity in the midst of chaos, and that choice changed everything." The letters still exist, hundreds of them, carefully preserved by both families. They sit in archives now, studied by historians as a testament to the power of connection, of empathy, of the small acts that shape large futures. And somewhere in those letters, in the careful handwriting of 2 girls who grew into women, who raised families and built lives, is a truth that war can never quite destroy. That even in the darkest times, even when the world is burning, people can choose to reach across divides and hold each other up. And that choice, small as it may seem, echoes forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.